The world mourned when Robin Williams passed in 2014, but behind the grief came a storm no one expected. His family locked in a painful battle over his $50 million estate. What began as a feud over slippers and memorabilia would take a shocking turn, reshaping his legacy forever. Shockwaves after the legend. August 11th, 2014. A day the world will never forget. The headlines came fast, brutal, and disbelieving. Robin Williams was gone. A man whose humor had carried generations through hardship, whose voice brought life to Aladdin's genie, and whose performances stitched laughter to tears, had left the stage for good. Fans wept. Comedians grieved. Hollywood dimmed its lights. The shock of his sudden passing was overwhelming, but behind the public mourning, a far more private storm was beginning to brew, one that would carry his family into bitter conflict. Williams had not been careless with his affairs. In fact, he had meticulously drafted a will and trust, determined to protect his loved ones and prevent the very kind of turmoil that often tears celebrity families apart. His plan divided his assets across two key homes, the beloved Tiburon residence in the Bay Area and a sprawling Napa Valley estate, along with memorabilia, financial support, and carefully chosen personal effects. To outsiders, it looked ironclad. To insiders, it became the seed of discord. The fault line began with his widow, Susan Schneider Williams. She and Robin had married in 2011, and by all accounts, theirs was a relationship filled with tenderness and companionship. But after his death, Susan found herself excluded from certain assets she believed Robin intended for her. The Napa property was earmarked for his 3 children, Zelda, Cody, and Zach, from previous marriages. The Tiburon home was designated for her living needs, yet disputes arose over what that truly meant. And when she realized that cherished personal belongings, items as small as slippers, as intimate as watches, as priceless as sentimental gifts, might be removed from the home before she could even return, the sense of betrayal was sharp. For Susan, this wasn't about millions in bank accounts. It was about the pieces of her husband's life that carried meaning, the everyday items that spoke to their marriage and her grief. For the children, it was about honoring their father's clear instructions, written into the trust years before. Tensions escalated with breathtaking speed. Within weeks of Robin's funeral, the mourning period was fractured by legal filings. What should have been a time of healing became instead a time of accusations. Susan believed she had no choice but to go to court. The children believed she was undermining their father's will. As one reporter observed, it was the cruelest irony. Robin spent a lifetime giving joy to others, but his death left his family in anguish. The world, still mourning the loss of one of its brightest lights, now watched as his loved ones stood on opposite sides of a courtroom. The very notion of legacy, what Robin left behind, and how he would be remembered, was suddenly at risk of being overshadowed by lawyers, filings, and bitter words. The stage was set for a battle that would test not just legal definitions, but human bonds. And at the center of it all was a grieving widow, forced to explain why she was fighting for what many saw as the smallest of things. The widow speaks out. For Susan Schneider Williams, grief was already unbearable. The man she loved, the partner she had planned a life with, was gone. Now, instead of being allowed to mourn in peace, she was forced to stand in court and fight for items as ordinary as slippers, for the right to return to her own home without fear that pieces of Robin's life would be stripped away. Her words, when she finally spoke publicly, were heavy with sorrow. She described feeling forced into court, not because of greed, but because she believed her place in Robin's life was being erased in the shadow of his death. The moment that crystallized her pain came when she was told certain items would be removed before she even returned home, like grief itself had been reduced to bureaucracy. "I was blindsided," she admitted. "I never thought I'd be fighting for the memories of my husband." For Susan, it wasn't about financial stakes. It was about dignity. The watch he wore, the bicycle he loved, the small wedding gifts that spoke of intimacy. These were not trophies or assets to her. They were the fragments of a marriage. They were the reminders of a man who had spent his life making others laugh, but had carried quiet battles of his own. Yet, in the harsh glare of public opinion, Susan's motives were questioned. Headlines painted her as a widow fighting over money, ignoring the emotional weight of her claims. The children argued that Robin's intentions were unambiguous, that his trust clearly divided belongings. Fans, already raw with grief, struggled to understand why the family of their beloved star was now locked in such conflict. Some labeled Susan's stand as selfish. Others saw it as the desperate act of a woman trying to preserve her place in her husband's story. The pain of being misunderstood was evident. While the children clung to the legal clarity of Robin's trust, Susan clung to the emotional truth of her marriage. The battle was never about luxury. It was about slippers, watches, even the home itself. A fight not over money, but over memory. Her testimony added a deeply personal weight to the proceedings. It reminded the world that behind every estate battle lies raw grief, that every item in question, whether a piece of furniture or an Academy Award, carries with it the shadow of the person who owned it. As one observer said, this wasn't just about inheritance, it was about whose grief was honored. And so, what began as a simple legal dispute evolved into something more profound, a test of respect. For Susan, the fight was about not being erased. For the children, it was about defending their father's explicit wishes. For the world, it became a window into the painful, messy intersection of law, love, and loss. The conflict was only beginning. And as the widow's voice rang out, the stage was set for an even deeper clash, one that would pit Robin's children against the woman who had stood by his side in his final years. Kids versus wife, conflicting claims. By early 2015, what had started as private tension spilled fully into the open. Robin Williams's children, Zelda, Cody, and Zach, were no longer just grieving their father, they were standing opposite their stepmother in court. What unfolded wasn't simply a legal fight over assets. It was a painful collision of grief, memory, and family identity. From the children's perspective, the matter was clear. Their father's trust had been written to protect them, and they insisted the terms were unambiguous. The Napa Valley estate, filled with belongings, collectibles, and personal effects, was designated for them. The Tiburon home, by contrast, was for Susan's use during her lifetime, to ensure she could live comfortably. The lines seemed simple: Napa for the kids, Tiburon for the widow. But grief doesn't follow legal language. To Susan, the trust's wording contained dangerous ambiguity. Phrases like memorabilia and personal items became battlegrounds. Did memorabilia mean movie posters and props, or did it include the tuxedo Robin wore to the Oscars? Did personal items cover his slippers and wedding gifts, or just furniture? These words, vague in the cold ink of legal drafting, carried immense emotional weight when tied to the man they had lost. The children accused Susan of stretching definitions to claim more than Robin intended. To them, it felt like self-interest, a stepmother attempting to shift boundaries at their expense. In filings, they argued Susan was undermining their father's explicit wishes. Some reports quoted them as feeling deeply hurt that the woman who shared Robin's final years seemed unwilling to honor the very plan he had painstakingly prepared. Susan countered passionately. For her, this was not greed. It was about ensuring that Robin's memory inside their home remained intact. That the small things, like the watch he wore every day or the bicycle he loved riding, would not be stripped away. She felt blindsided, painted as the villain, when all she wanted was to preserve fragments of her husband's life. "I was not fighting for money," she said later. "I was fighting for love." The emotional contrast became stark. On one side, the children, relying on trust documents, determined to protect their inheritance and the integrity of their father's instructions. On the other, the widow, appealing to emotion and intimacy, fighting for the little things that told the story of a marriage. The courtroom tension mirrored a broader truth. Estate battles are rarely about wealth alone. They're about the stories objects carry, the bonds they represent, the grief they amplify. A bicycle isn't just steel and rubber, it's memories of joy. A pair of slippers isn't just fabric, it's a reminder of comfort, of intimacy, of home. By this stage, the public was riveted. News outlets described the dispute as both tragic and inevitable. One journalist wrote, "It was as if Robin's death created two competing versions of love, the children's love of a father and the widow's love of a husband." The fight threatened to become brutal. Each filing seemed to pull the family further apart, each court date amplifying wounds that were still raw. Yet even as lawyers sharpened their arguments, there were whispers of another path, one that could prevent this battle from becoming a public circus. And that path came in the form of mediation. Legal crossroads and mediation. By April 2015, the Williams family saga had reached a breaking point. The case was inching closer to a full trial, the kind that would drag every detail of Robin's personal life into headlines. Judges, lawyers, and even close friends recognized the risk. A prolonged public war could overshadow everything Robin Williams had stood for. So the court urged a different route: mediation. Mediation is quieter than trial, less about winners and losers, more about compromise. It was, perhaps, the only way to preserve both dignity and privacy. Susan agreed. The children agreed. Not because they suddenly saw eye to eye, but because neither side wanted Robin's memory reduced to weeks of televised testimony. But the stakes were enormous. Lawyers warned that if the mediation failed, the fight would erupt into arbitration and then trial. The clock was ticking, and they had only a few weeks to settle. The atmosphere was tense. Each side came to the table with pain that wasn't just legal. It was personal. Susan, still raw from losing her husband, feared being erased from the story of their life together. The children, equally devastated, feared losing pieces of their father's legacy to definitions twisted by grief. One observer noted, "This was not just about assets. It was about identity, about who Robin Williams belonged to after his death." Behind closed doors, negotiations dragged. Mediators worked carefully, knowing every word mattered. What exactly counted as memorabilia? Did awards belong with the children who shared their father's career pride? Or could some remain in Tiburon, where Susan could keep them close? Could everyday objects, like watches, bicycles, and wedding gifts, be separated from the glamorous trophies and collectibles? These weren't just legal puzzles. They were emotional landmines. All the while, the public waited, Tabloids speculated about breakdowns in the talks. Fans feared the worst, that Robin's memory would be scarred by years of bitter litigation. The thought of his widow and his children battling endlessly over his belongings felt cruel, almost unbearable. Still, hope lingered. Even in their differences, both sides knew that Robin had spent his life trying to bring joy and light to the world. To let his memory collapse into legal acrimony would feel like the ultimate betrayal. One mediator recalled, "Every time the talks stalled, we reminded them, what would Robin want? That kept us moving." It was fragile, it was difficult, but slowly, painstakingly, progress was made. The possibility of peace began to emerge from the ashes of conflict. And then, in the fall of 2015, the family announced what few thought possible. A settlement had been reached. A surprising settlement. In October 2015, after months of tense negotiation, the Williams family finally announced what many doubted could ever happen: a settlement. The news arrived like a sigh of relief after a storm. For over a year, the widow and the children had stood on opposite sides of the courtroom, their grief sharpened into legal filings. Now, at last, a fragile peace had been reached. The terms were telling. Susan would retain a life estate in the Tiburon home, the house she had shared with Robin. This meant she could continue living there for the rest of her life, with financial support allocated to maintain the property. It wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about dignity, about not being forced to abandon the place where she and Robin had built memories. But the heart of the settlement lay not in homes, but in objects, the small, deeply personal belongings that had fueled the most painful disputes. Susan received items of emotional significance: wedding gifts, a watch, a bicycle, and other pieces that connected her to Robin's daily life. To outsiders, these might have seemed trivial. To her, they were treasures. "They are what keep him close," she said quietly. The children, meanwhile, inherited the bulk of Robin's memorabilia. More than 50 bicycles, 85 watches, numerous awards, trophies, and collectibles from his long career. For Zelda, Zach, and Cody, these were the symbols of their father's public life, the reminders of a man who had not only been their dad, but also a global icon. Both sides walked away with something meaningful, and more importantly, without the scars of a public trial. One journalist described the outcome as a settlement not of money but of memory. The agreement was widely reported, not just for what it resolved, but for what it avoided. The risk of a high-profile, bitter feud had loomed large. Instead, the family emerged with a resolution that honored both love and law. Robin's legacy, so close to being clouded by conflict, now seemed preserved. Behind closed doors, the relief was palpable. Susan issued a statement saying the settlement allowed her to live in peace knowing my husband's wishes were honored. The children echoed that sentiment, expressing their gratitude that the matter was behind them and that they could finally grieve without the weight of litigation. For the public, the settlement was both surprising and comforting. It proved that even in the aftermath of heartbreak, even in the complexity of blended families and vast estates, compassion could win out. It was, in its own way, one final performance of Robin's spirit, a reminder that light could follow darkness. And yet, peace on paper did not mean the pain disappeared. The emotional fallout of the settlement was just beginning. Settlement's emotional fallout. The October settlement marked the legal end of the Williams estate battle, but the emotional consequences rippled far beyond courtrooms and contracts. For Susan, the agreement brought bittersweet relief. She could remain in the Tiburon home, surrounded by the walls that once echoed with Robin's laughter. She could keep the intimate belongings, the slippers, the bicycle, the watch, that made her feel like he was still present in everyday life. "I can live in peace," she said, "knowing my husband's wishes were honored." For Robin's children, the settlement offered closure of a different kind. They gained custody of their father's professional memorabilia, awards, trophies, collections that symbolized his decades of artistry. But more than that, they gained freedom from a battle that had stretched their grief into legal warfare. Zelda admitted privately that the agreement allowed them to finally focus on remembering Dad, not fighting over him. The public, too, felt the weight of the resolution. Fans who had followed every headline were reminded that beneath the celebrity shine lay real human pain. The estate battle was not a greedy squabble. It was a human struggle between love, law, and loss. Yet the settlement didn't erase scars. For Susan, the experience had been a brutal introduction to the complexities of blended family estate disputes. She had been painted unfairly in tabloids, accused of greed when she was really fighting for remembrance. For the children, the conflict was a reminder of how fragile family bonds can become under legal strain. A family united in grief had nearly been divided forever. Still, something remarkable emerged from the ashes: compassion. Both Susan and the children ultimately recognized that continuing the fight would dishonor Robin's memory. Their ability to reach compromise, even after months of bitterness, became the final act of love they could give him. For fans, the story carried a lesson. Robin Williams had given the world joy, but his death revealed a truth too often hidden. Grief does not make families perfect. It complicates, divides, and sometimes wounds. But it can also heal. By settling, the Williams family gave themselves permission to grieve properly, away from flashing cameras and endless legal filings. They reminded the world that even in the darkest family disputes, peace is possible. And yet, in the shadows of this fragile peace, new revelations would soon reframe everything. The real battle Robin had faced, not in courtrooms, but in his own mind and body. The shadow of sickness and secret struggles. Just as the dust from the estate battle began to settle, a heartbreaking truth emerged, one that changed the way the world saw both Robin Williams' death and the painful family conflict that followed. In the months after his passing, doctors revealed what Robin had really been battling: Lewy body dementia, LBD, a rare and devastating neurological disease that is often misdiagnosed. At the time of his death, Robin had been told he had Parkinson's disease. The diagnosis explained some of his tremors, but not the deeper struggles: paranoia, confusion, insomnia, and crushing depression. Only after his autopsy did the full picture come into focus. Robin had not been fighting just one illness, but a hidden storm inside his brain. His widow, Susan Schneider Williams, later described it as the terrorist inside my husband's head. This revelation reframed everything: the suddenness of his passing, the legal battles that followed, even the misunderstandings between Susan and the children. What the world had mistaken for personal demons was actually the work of a disease that stripped Robin of clarity, stability, and ultimately, hope. Susan dedicated herself to telling this story. She became an advocate for awareness, determined that her husband's legacy would not be reduced to tabloids or court battles. In 2020, she helped produce the documentary Robin's Wish, which laid bare the truth about Lewy body dementia. In it, she explained how symptoms had appeared without warning, how Robin had struggled to understand what was happening to him, and how the family had been blindsided by an illness that robbed them of time and peace. The revelation brought compassion where judgment once stood. Fans who had been left confused by the contradictions of Robin's final years now saw him not as a man who gave up, but as a man overpowered by a disease no one could see. As one critic wrote after the documentary's release, Robin didn't take his life because he lost hope. He fought to the end against an invisible enemy. For Susan, the estate battle now seemed even more tragic. The conflict over slippers, watches, and memorabilia was not the product of greed, but the natural confusion that comes when grief collides with misunderstanding. The vague wording of the trust, the emotions of the widow, the protectiveness of the children, all of it played out in the shadow of a sickness they barely understood at the time. This context changed everything. What once looked like a family divided by money now appeared as a family struggling to make sense of loss, made worse by confusion. It revealed that Robin's final chapter was not about scandal, but about struggle, his against his own body, and his family's against grief. The shadow of LBD stretched long, but in revealing the truth, Susan helped transform the narrative. Instead of being remembered for a fight over an estate, Robin's name became linked to awareness, advocacy, and compassion for those battling neurological disease. And yet, even as clarity emerged, another reality lingered: the sheer value of Robin's estate and the lessons it carried for blended families everywhere. The cost of legacy. Robin Williams' estate, valued at more than $50 million, was the result of decades of comedy, television, and blockbuster success. Yet his death revealed a painful truth. Wealth does not shield families from conflict. Sometimes it magnifies it. The 2015 settlement divided assets with sharp precision. Robin's children inherited the bulk of his memorabilia: over 50 bicycles, 85 watches, his awards, and countless props collected across a legendary career. These weren't just financial assets, they were pieces of his identity, tokens of artistry, and symbols of a father who belonged as much to the public as to them. His widow, Susan, was granted the Tiburon home, financial support for its upkeep, and certain deeply personal belongings. These weren't extravagant luxuries, but items that tethered her to their marriage: a bicycle, a wedding gift, a favorite watch. For her, they were priceless, not for their market value, but because they carried memory. Both sides walked away with what they needed, but not without scars. The cost of legacy wasn't measured only in dollars. It was sleepless nights, strained relationships, and the very public airing of grief. The irony was cruel. Robin had tried to protect his loved ones with a carefully structured trust. Yet vague terms like memorabilia and personal effects created the very conflict he'd hoped to prevent. Legal experts called it a cautionary tale, reminding families, especially blended ones, that clarity in estate planning must go hand in hand with communication. As one analyst said, an estate plan should protect both the heart and the trust. Robin showed us what happens when one is overlooked. In the end, the fiercest battles weren't over millions, but over slippers and wedding gifts. And maybe that was the truest cost of all, because legacy is never just money, it's memory. Lessons in love, legacy, and law. When the Williams estate battle ended, it left behind more than headlines. It became a lesson in how fragile the balance between love, legacy, and law can be. Robin had prepared a will and trust, but vague words like memorabilia and personal effects fueled conflict. For his children, those meant awards and collectibles. For Susan, they meant slippers, wedding gifts, even a bicycle. The fight wasn't about millions. It was about memories inside objects. Experts called it a cautionary tale. Assets aren't just things, they're grief and love. Families must plan not only with documents, but with communication. Both Susan and the children were acting out of love, but love collided with law, and grief turned into turmoil. The shocking turn from conflict to compassion. For over a year, the world expected a bitter feud. Instead, the 2015 settlement turned conflict into compassion. Susan kept the Tiburon home and personal items, while the children received their father's memorabilia and awards. Both sides walked away with peace. Later, Robin's hidden struggle with Lewy body dementia reframed the battle, not as greed, but as grief. What could have been a courtroom tragedy became a story of reconciliation. As one commentator said, Robin gave the world laughter. In death, he gave his family the chance to rediscover compassion. In the end, the shocking turn wasn't the money, it was the compassion. A widow and children, once divided, found peace through compromise. Robin's true legacy wasn't in assets or trophies, but in the healing that followed grief. Even in death, he gave the world one last gift: reconciliation.